What happens when the institutions we trust to protect us become the very things that compound our harm? Hi, I'm Saralya Narayanan, trainee counselor, researcher, and someone who sat across from survivors who know exactly what this feels like. This is my master's dissertation. In my work as a trainee counselor in a domestic abuse setting, what struck me repeatedly wasn't just the trauma survivors carried from what happened to them. It was what happened when they tried to get help. The disbelief, the procedural obstruction, the silence, the slow grinding realization that the system they had turned to wasn't going to protect them. This realization in itself was doing harm. In September 2024, Giselle Pellicot stood in a French courtroom and waived her anonymity so the world could see what had been done to her. She said something that stopped people in their tracks, that shame must change sides, that it belongs to the perpetrators and not the survivors. Sexual trauma doesn't end with the event. What comes after shapes everything. Who believes you? Who supports you? How does the institution you depend on respond? Research studying this has grown rapidly since 2013, when institutional betrayal was first formally defined. But it has remained scattered across different populations, different institutional contexts, different objectives. This review collates that work to build a comprehensive picture of what the evidence collectively tells us about survivors' mental health. My research question was this: what is the impact of institutional betrayal on PTSD symptoms among survivors of sexual trauma? To answer it, I conducted a systematic review of 18 studies across universities, military organizations, religious institutions, legal systems, and criminal justice contexts. What I found was consistent, troubling, and I think urgent. But we'll get to that. First, what is institutional betrayal and why does it matter? Let me give you some context. Globally, an estimated 840 million women experience sexual violence annually. And that figure doesn't cover male survivors, non-binary survivors, or the many cases that go unreported. Among the most significant and well-documented consequences of sexual violence is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivors of sexual trauma are substantially more likely to develop PTSD symptoms than survivors of other forms of trauma. Approximately 1 in 3 will meet the diagnostic criteria at some point in their lifetime. But PTSD symptoms don't emerge in a vacuum. Recovery is shaped by many things: social support, disclosure experiences, and crucially, the responses of the systems that survivors turn to for help. This is where betrayal trauma theory comes in. First proposed by Jennifer Freyd in 1994, betrayal trauma theory holds that trauma is more psychologically harmful when it is perpetrated by, or occurs in the context of, a relationship that the victim depends on. The greater the dependency, the greater the harm when that trust is broken. Smith and Freyd extended this in 2013 to institutional contexts, coining the term institutional betrayal to describe what happens when institutions fail to prevent, acknowledge, or respond supportively to sexual trauma occurring within their structures. And here's what's important. Institutional betrayal may not always be intentional. It can emerge from policy structures, from mandatory reporting requirements that override survivors' agency over their own stories, or from a culture of institutional self-protection that quietly prioritizes reputation over people. Universities, military organizations, religious institutions, legal systems, criminal justice processes all have the power to compound or to alleviate the harm that survivors carry. So, I went looking for evidence. This review followed the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses guidelines. Every decision, every inclusion, every exclusion has been documented and is traceable. The search strategy was built around three concepts: sexual trauma, institutional betrayal, and PTSD symptoms. 6 databases were searched through Bangor University Access, APA PsycInfo, PsycArticles, Social Sciences, Scopus, Web of Science, and PubMed or Medline. The search was structured using the PICO framework: population, survivors of sexual trauma; intervention, institutional betrayal; comparison, survivors who did not experience institutional betrayal; and outcome, PTSD symptoms. That search returned 2,132 records across all 6 databases. 844 were then removed because they were duplicates. I then screened the remaining 1,288 titles and abstracts. 30 went to full text review. 12 were excluded, either because they didn't examine the relationship between institutional betrayal and PTSD directly, or because they were review level studies with overlapping findings. 18 studies made the final cut. The studies were then put through rigorous quality appraisal using the Mixed Methods Appraisal Tool, the MMAT, specifically designed for reviews that include qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies, which this one does. 12 studies were rated high quality, 5 moderate, and none low. The one narrative review in the dataset was assessed descriptively, since the MMAT isn't designed for review level studies. One thing that became clear early in the extraction process was the variability in how institutional betrayal was measured across studies. 4 studies used the original Institutional Betrayal Questionnaire, or the IBQ. Others used adapted versions: the IBQ2, the IBSQ, a judicial specific scale, and qualitative interviews. This variability in how institutional betrayal was operationalized will be addressed further down. PTSD symptoms, by contrast, were measured with striking consistency. 12 out of the 18 studies used the same tool, the PCL5. Now, to the part that I find most fascinating. What does all of this actually say? 18 studies, 5 institutional contexts: qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, and one finding that holds across all of them. Survivors who experienced institutional betrayal reported significantly more severe PTSD symptoms than those who did not, across every single context. In university settings, 7 studies examined campus sexual violence and institutional responses. Survivors who reported institutional betrayal, being disbelieved, facing procedural barriers, encountering mandatory reporting processes that removed their agency, consistently reported higher PTSD symptoms. One study found that 71% of campus sexual violence survivors reported at least one form of institutional betrayal, and those who did reported higher PTSD symptoms, depression, and anxiety. In military contexts, 5 studies told a similar story. Command structures, peer responses, the culture of the institution itself, all shaping whether survivors felt protected or abandoned. One study found that institutional betrayal was correlated not only with PTSD symptoms, but also with depression, suicidal ideation, and non-suicidal self-injury. Another found that the gendered culture of the military and the exploitation of a sense of duty actively exacerbated harm, and that the overall tone survivors described was one of betrayal, by peers, by superiors, by the institution as a whole. Religious institutions. 3 studies, and perhaps the context where the compounding nature of institutional betrayal is most visceral, because for most survivors, the institution wasn't just where the trauma occurred. It was where they found meaning, community, identity. When that institution responded with silence, with victim blaming, with the misuse of scripture, The harm wasn't only psychological, it was also spiritual. Legal and criminal justice contexts. Two studies and both revealing. One examined judicial betrayal among survivors of intimate partner violence, finding that it partially mediated the relationship between legal abuse and PTSD symptoms. The other examined what happened when survivors of sexual assault were notified years later that their sexual assault kits had been sitting untested. Survivors described feeling overwhelmed, triggered, re-traumatized, angry, and vindicated, all at once. That complexity of response is something a PTSD checklist score can't fully capture. And that is exactly why the qualitative studies in this review matter. Because behind every statistically significant finding is a person. And the qualitative evidence in this review reminds us of that weight, be it from survivors of military sexual trauma, from survivors in Hong Kong faith communities, or survivors navigating the criminal justice system.
Beyond the direct relationship, several studies examined what sits between institutional betrayal and PTSD symptoms. Self-blame emerged as a significant mediator, potentially as a response to institutional messaging. When an institution implies, through inaction or dismissal, that a survivor bears some responsibility, that message gets internalized, and it does damage. Rumination, or the ongoing cognitive processing of the traumatic experience, was also independently associated with PTSD symptoms alongside institutional betrayal. When an institution fails to provide resolution, validation, or closure, survivors may remain anchored to the experience, repeatedly returning to the question of why they weren't believed, why they weren't protected. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors reported significantly higher rates of both institutional betrayal and PTSD symptoms than heterosexual survivors, suggesting that for those whose identities are already marginalized within institutional structures, betrayal carries an additional layer of identity based rejection. The evidence across all 18 studies points in the same direction. Institutional betrayal compounds psychological harm consistently across contexts, across populations, across methodologies.
The consistency of this finding across such different institutional settings suggests that the harmful mechanism of institutional betrayal isn't specific to universities or the military or the church. It reflects something more fundamental about what happens when the structures people depend on for safety and justice become sources of additional harm. Betrayal trauma theory predicted this. This review extends its reach considerably beyond the campus settings where most of the foundational research was done. What emerges from this evidence is not a picture of survivors failing to engage with institutional processes. It is a picture of institutions failing to respond to survivors in a way that protects rather than compounds their harm. For clinicians, this has direct implications. Working with survivors of sexual trauma means attending not only to what happened, but to what happened when they sought help. Institutional betrayal may represent a distinct and compounding traumatic experience that requires its own therapeutic attention, separate from but related to the original trauma. The shame and self-attribution following institutional failure, the internalized message that somehow this was their fault, may need to be as central to therapeutic work as the trauma itself. And beyond the therapy room, institutions themselves have a clinical responsibility. How an institution responds to a disclosure of sexual trauma is not a procedural matter. It is an intervention, for better or worse. Trauma-informed institutional practices like transparent reporting procedures, non-punitive responses, and active support for survivors navigating formal processes are not just good policy. On the basis of this evidence, they are a clinical necessity. No research is without limitations, and being honest about them is part of doing research well.
This review was conducted by a single reviewer, me. Without a second independent reviewer, there is an inherent risk of subjective interpretation at each stage. Every effort was made to ground decisions in the evidence and document them systematically, but that limitation is real and worth naming. The studies included a predominantly cross-sectional in design. That means we can see that institutional betrayal and PTSD symptoms are related, but we cannot say with certainty which comes first or whether something else entirely accounts for both. Establishing that causal direction is one of the most important next steps for this field. The samples across these 18 studies were predominantly white, female, and based in the United States. What institutional betrayal looks like and what it does in other cultural contexts for male survivors, for non binary survivors, transgender survivors, for survivors of color, remains significantly underexplored. There is also the variability in how institutional betrayal was measured across studies, which we flagged in the methods section. Without a standardized measure applicable across institutional contexts, direct comparison of effect sizes remains limited.
And that brings me to where research needs to go next. Longitudinal studies following survivors through institutional processes in real time can help researchers establish the direction of the relationship between institutional betrayal and PTSD symptoms, and also to identify where intervention could be the most helpful. Greater demographic diversity in samples is necessary because the experience of institutional betrayal is not uniform, and the evidence base should reflect that. A standardized measure of institutional betrayal, applicable consistently across institutional contexts, would aid comparison of findings and help draw more robust conclusions. And perhaps most urgently, research examining institutional support as a protective factor and not just institutional betrayal as a risk factor would give clinicians and policymakers something genuinely actionable to work with. Because the goal isn't just to document the harm, it is to understand what prevents it. 18 studies, 5 institutional contexts, 1 consistent finding. When institutions fail survivors of sexual trauma, the psychological cost is real, consistent, and measurable. Giselle Pellicott said, "Shame must change sides." This review asks what the evidence tells us about where responsibility lies and what it demands of the people and institutions that have the power to respond differently.